Welcome, everyone. My name is Daniel Stid. I direct the Madison Initiative at the Hewlett Foundation. It's my privilege to be here at a terrific conference, and thank you to the organizers and also to what promises to be a really interesting panel. In setting it up and also kind of bridging out a little bit to yesterday, let me pull through a theme or two and then also preview one or two that might come up here. Yesterday I was struck by the fact how in each of the panels, the challenge of executive power and the extent to which the presidency in the U.S. is or can be constrained by something approximating the rule of law was a theme that several people touched on, and I think you'll hear that again today. So that's one thing to be looking for. I think a second theme is in keeping with the goal of the conference to use different disciplinary lenses on this problem. The lenses we talked about yesterday, in which Valerie Bunce will represent here today, the comparative angle on American politics. Our discussant will bring that to bear again. We'll also have a historical angle. But I think we'll also hear today from the standpoint of international relations and how the necessities or the perceived necessities of relations among nations is shaping what's happening within our political system, in particular as it pertains to the power of the presidency. And then the third theme, which people had different angles on yesterday, is whether the president represents, as the saying goes, a wolf at the door pounding away, or whether his stomping around is just pointing out that we have some termites in our basement that have been doing their work for some time. And we have I think, different views on this question within the panel, so we'll have a full and frank exchange of views on this topic, I can promise. So let me introduce the panelists, and we'll jump in here. To my immediate right is Eliot Cohen, who's the Osgood Professor of Strategic Studies and newly appointed Vice Dean at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And his most recent book on the topic is The Big Stick, The Limits of Soft Power and the Necessity of Military Force. To Eliot's right is Larry Jacobs. He's the Mondale Chair for Political Studies and the Director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Government at the Hubert Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota. And a recent book that Larry's written on the presidency is Who Governs? Presidents, Public Opinion, and Manipulation. To Larry's right is Kori Schake. Kori is the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Her most recent book is Safe Passage, The Transition from British to American Hegemony. And then finally, our discussant, Valerie Bunce, is a professor of international studies and government at Cornell, and a book that she recently co-authored that will be relevant for us today is Defeating Authoritarian Leaders in Post-Communist Countries. So we'll jump right in. Each of the speakers will have 10 minutes. I'll be there giving you the various signals, and then we'll open things up a little bit on the panel and move things out for questions. So, Eliot?
Thank you. So here I am at New America Foundation as one of the good guys. Pretty weird times. So I want to thank the organizers of this conference. I was here for most of it yesterday. I thought it was terrific. It was a great opportunity to reconnect with some dear old friends from graduate school days. That was also wonderful. I'm not going to try to summarize or recap the two articles that I passed on to the organizers. Instead, I want to address by making 3 points what I take to be the two meta questions that float over this, which were just alluded to in a way. First, is Trump symptom or cause? And the answer is obviously some kind of mixture of both, and the question is what the mixture. And I think secondly, this struck me listening to everybody yesterday, is what parts of this are truly unusual and what parts of this are either Republican normal or somewhat worse versions of normal. So 3 points. First, the president himself. Having a president who comes into office relatively ill-informed about national security and foreign policy, governed by unexamined instincts rather than careful study, normal. I mean it. Lack of seriousness, once in, disengagement from information, inability to grow, extraordinary volatility, witness the turnaround on TPP today, visible emotional volatility and extreme vulnerability, including to foreign manipulation, and all of the unilateralism represented in America First, abnormal. Second thing, and this does, normal. The institutional centralization of foreign policy and national security making in the presidency, that's been going on for a long time. It is normal for the president to disagree with his subordinates. You know, Wilson didn't always get along with Lansing. Roosevelt, you know, cut Cordell Hull out of a whole lot of foreign policy making. We now have an institutionalized structure in the executive office of the president, which has to be there, I believe, to manage foreign policy and national security, completely normal. And basic fights, yeah, normal. What's abnormal is the kind of schizophrenia you get when you talk to members of the administration about American foreign policy and national security. They never mention the president. They never do. And they talk about it all as if he doesn't really exist, but of course he does. Or if you look at something like the National Security Strategy, which is always an incoherent document, it's always a really ugly baby that its authors have to say is a beautiful baby because they suffered so much in the birthing. This you really have to read like a biblical scholar. You know, there's Isaiah, there's Deutero-Isaiah, there's Trito-Isaiah. They actually had completely different views of the world. They probably wrote at different times. Genuinely schizophrenic, genuinely schizophrenic. And I would say that is even reflected in the most recent appointments. Bolton and Pompeo are kind of hardline but Republican normal. The president is not. And the problem is that the president is the guy in charge. And I think we will all delude ourselves if we think that he will really be constrained by these people, except to a very limited degree. I think the current team will be more skillful at manipulating him and soothing him, but fundamentally the driver is going to remain the president himself. And that can potentially be very dangerous. That could potentially get us into a big war. By the way, the one thing I didn't hear yesterday, not surprisingly, was the possibility as we look into the future that there can be all kinds of external disruptions from outside the United States. We could get into a whacking big war on the Korean Peninsula, or in Syria, or in Eastern Europe, or in the South China Sea, and that will have all kinds of repercussions for domestic politics. And at the same time, I would also say that even when the foreign policy looks kind of normal, and I have said this to the very, very, very few friends I have in the administration, that they will make a very big mistake if they try to take this country into a war when more than 50% of the American population thinks that the president is a liar as well as a louse. And that is a very serious proposition, and that is not something we have done in the past. The American people have concluded that the president was that in some cases, but only after the war was well underway. So I think there's that. And then the last thing I want to say is that all this is happening, all the chaos and turmoil and eccentricity is happening at a time of structural challenge. What I'm about to say is about like 3 lectures worth in 4 minutes. The American global role in maintaining world order rested, I believe, on 5 interlocking beliefs which crystallized at the end of World War II. And those were, and I am simplifying wildly, first, that the crisis of the 30s and 40s happened in part because the United States was absent from the international scene. That had multiple consequences, one of which was a devastating economic disruption on top of the calamity of the First World War, in which actually quite a body of American opinion thought we should have been in there earlier. That in turn bred proposition number 3, totalitarianism, which I think you can make a convincing argument. American decision makers from both parties says that's the root cause of the world wars and it's the root issue of the Cold War. The result of that was an even more devastating war, World War II, and of course its culmination in the development of nuclear weapons, which really had the potential to end civilization. Those are the stakes. Civilization ending war. And that finally, in turn, meant that the United States needed to be a global power in all dimensions, leading a set of multinational and international organizations to maintain some rough world order. Vastly oversimplified. Reasonable people can question whether those 5 interlocking propositions still hold in the world of today. And I've always felt that there was bound to be there should have been a quite profound foreign policy debate after the end of the Cold War. I remain an unrepentant globalist, by the way, about these issues. It didn't happen because the 1990s were the period of the Great Picnic. The 2000s were the period of the Great Emergency. So the debate didn't occur, really. I mean, it was raised in some ways by people like Rand Paul in one way and Bernie Sanders in a different way. Well, unfortunately now it's getting raised in the worst possible way by a kind of unhinged autocrat. And that's really dangerous and unfortunate. But that is, I believe, the structural issue that is underneath everything. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. And I look forward to this conversation. I've been quite struck by the conversation that started yesterday, and I think one of the things that struck me in listening to the presentations was the focus on Donald Trump's personality and his personal governing style. Obviously relevant and critical, but it also seems to me a risk to blot out the analysis and to be somewhat at odds with the larger institutional regime-oriented analysis that the organizers focused us on, and that's really my orientation. I'm glad to talk about individual policies, but I'm taking the organizers at their word that they want to focus on system level. And it strikes me from that perspective, the area of national security and foreign policy may actually be an area where we are starting to see regime change in terms of democratic accountability. Oh, okay, it's here. You may have been seeing this pop up now and again. I had nothing to do with this, but here's the slides. You know, it's really quite extraordinary when you look at Donald Trump's policies, but it's actually, in some level, quite ordinary if you look at the authority that he's been claiming to act unilaterally. This is not surprising or uncommon in terms of the last 60 to 70 years of U.S. foreign policy. And so I want to click through some of the policy areas that we've been seeing Donald Trump move through like a wrecking ball, and whether the building is completely demolished or it's just kind of a wing of the building and it may be rebuilt, who knows? But clearly this has been an extraordinary moment. We've seen him just in the area of international agreements doing, and I would say policy understandings, doing quite a bit of work. There's been an understanding that when a new administration comes in, even when they're saddled with a policy on the international level that they don't support, whether it's Paris or it's the Iran deal, they manage it. They don't discard it. And in the usual kind of conversation about an incoming administration, you talk about the legacy that they carry. And this has been true for many decades, and yet Donald Trump has done away with Paris Treaty. Despite what he says, it's now out of the way, and Iran may well be on the chopping blocks. In terms of managed trade, whether it's in the dustbin of history, we'll see, but clearly we're heading in that direction. Then there's been a unilateral dropping of some very significant, longstanding policy commitments with regards to recognizing the president's recognition of Jerusalem as a capital of Israel, the downplaying of human rights or abandonment of human rights as a core feature of both Democratic and Republican administrations for 4 decades, the kind of uneasy relationship now with NATO, which is unthinkable. And the question you may be asking as you've watched all this happen is, how did he do that? Let's move on to here's the key point here. How did he do that? Because it's been done for many years. This is a photograph of Jimmy Carter, who unilaterally terminated the Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan in the late 1970s. Now, this is a critical component of our policy with the two Chinas, and you may know the Constitution and the clear language about the ratification of a treaty, and you will know there's silence about how you terminate them. And President Carter grabbed that authority, and it's become now part of the repertoire of power that presidents have. The area of use of military force is now quite common for presidents to unilaterally deploy U.S. forces. We've seen Donald Trump substantially increase airstrikes, and along with the civilian casualties that have gone along with that. But it's also important to say that under Barack Obama, he was also quite active, both in the active battlefields of Afghanistan and Pakistan, of Afghanistan and Iraq, but also off the active battlefields in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia, and elsewhere. And this idea of presidents calling the shots when it comes to the deployment of U.S. military force is not controversial within this town. It's considered to be part of the repertoire of presidential power. Now you may wonder, wait a second, what about the Constitution? Because, of course, Article 1 gives Congress tremendous power in the area of war making and in the use and management of U.S. military forces. And what we've seen over particularly the last 6 decades, but you can trace it back further, is an extraordinary assertion of presidential war powers, nearly unlimited, nearly unlimited. There's a kind of a dance that goes on, but presidents want to use military power, they do. The legislative powers, which again are quite extensive, are minimized and largely ignored. Donald Trump's deployment of military forces, particularly airstrikes, has been questioned. Jack Goldsmith, who's a prominent legal mind in this area and was a prominent figure in the Bush administration and the Justice Department, came out and said that there's no practical limit on presidential power when it comes to Donald Trump. Again, it's a mistake, and I think, frankly, journalists fall into this all the time, to think this is unique to Donald Trump. Hardly. Here's George W. Bush, took us into war with Iraq. In this case, there was a congressional vote, but the nature of that war and the extent of the war and the scope of it may not have been anticipated. And when you combine the military actions abroad along with the counterterrorism measures here in the United States, there were a lot of questions. Here's candidate Barack Obama, who is questioning what he sees as an ad hoc approach and questioning the president's failure to follow our legal traditions, to be unconstitutional. Now, that's President Obama, but I have to tell you that Jack Goldsmith wrote a terrific book in which he talks about the continuity between George Bush and Barack Obama. And certainly Barack Obama, I would say, fits very squarely in this tradition. Now, one of the things about the Daily News, how many people here read the Daily News? Or see it, at least. I know you don't read it. We're all too smart. Daily News is a great place to go because they take words and they put it with a picture. And when Donald Trump talked about bringing fire and fury to North Korea, the Daily News found a picture that would just light up the sky, literally. And if this doesn't keep you up at night, I don't know what will. But getting less attention was the president's justification for this. He said, what I do is authorize my military. And again, this fits very squarely in this tradition I'm talking about, this idea that it's my military that he's authorizing. This is a radical departure from the constitutional system. And it really has now put us squarely on the cusp of a nightmare scenario of the president using nukes and arguing quite correctly that this is an extension of established presidential power. This is what it could look like. There's actually been congressional hearings on this. Bob Corker said we could be on the path to World War III. Now, I want to move along a little quickly here because I'm running out of time. My argument here is that the culprit is not only the aberrant personality of Donald Trump. That's relevant, but it's not the only thing. Instead, we need to look at the institutional development. And it seems to me that Donald Trump is capitalizing on the rolling back of constitutional checks that has been done by Democratic and Republican presidents for quite some time. And Donald Trump succeeds partly because partisanship in this arena is only partial. And certainly we've seen a diminution of rigorous scrutiny in Congress. But let's be honest, if you look back over time, you're not finding situations of intense congressional scrutiny and checking when there's been divided government. Instead, it seems to me that it really is a pattern of institutional conduct. And I want to talk about a few different dimensions of this. One is that presidents, again, successive presidents going back a number of decades, have built an increasingly large, effective, and independent government and private national security apparatus. It's quite substantial, almost 900,000 top security clearances for individuals, 10,000 locations. This is enormous, and that's just the private sector. There's an accord among elites that justifies the president's diminishing and reduction of the congressional role, that elevates presidential power to a spot of unquestioned authority in this area. And the courts largely tolerate this. There's a terrific illustration of this. I'm going to take two more minutes. One more minute. Okay. The terrific illustration of this when Barack Obama assassinated a U.S. citizen, three U.S. citizens in Yemen. There's no doubt the case is a horrific case in terms of what was being planned. But Rand Paul was the one who came out and questioned where was the Constitution. And it's a good question. So what are some responses to this? Well, I think one response would be to leave the institutional capacity and authority of the president intact. And there are reasons for that, the nature of the threat, some support Donald Trump's policy, and then the institutional stickiness of trying to dislodge the tremendous power and position of the national security apparatus. It seems to me, though, if we're serious about regime change that's underway, in this area at least, that we might look to increase scrutiny and attention. And I've described this as targeted disruption because, frankly, I think it's too ambitious to even try to tackle what I've discussed. And there's three dimensions to this. One is organizing lawyers, who are very helpful in the legal process, as well as community groups, and then communities. And we've seen some of this, but it's been striking how the resistance has been mostly limited to domestic policy. I think spotlighting unilateral use of troops and our Air Force and drones is another area. And finally, questioning airstrikes and the tremendous civilian casualties. What I would say is I think the issue here is not about American interest and the Constitution. That's a false trade-off. I think American interests and the kind of patriotism that E.J. Dionne was talking about yesterday is well served by taking a hard look at the nature of our unaccountable presidency.
So I am one of those snotty Republicans who signed Eliot's letter saying that candidate Trump was unsuited to the presidency and we ought all to mobilize against him. So it won't surprise you that I agree with everything Eliot said. But I do think this is a really important question about whether there is structural erosion, whether the system is working or not. And I am increasingly sanguine that the system is working, that in fact, institutions as designed are, to my eyes, surprisingly resilient in the face of consistent efforts by the president to erode them. So I'm actually not that worried about the fate of the country. I'm less worried about the fate of the country than I was 18 months ago. and full of admiration for the founding fathers to have built so robust a system. Those of you who are art fans will recall that in 1913, there was a big famous show at the Armory in New York City, bringing European modern art to America. And Theodore Roosevelt went to see the exhibit and wrote a review of it. And he said, "This is a subject not of artistic, but of psychological importance," right? He thought that it was psychiatrically disturbed, the art that was on view at the Armory. And that's kind of the way I feel about the Trump administration, right? That it's actually clear, the president is clearly unsound. He would clearly be dangerous if he had the capacity to be dangerous. The people he has surrounded himself with are a wildly uneven quality and ability. And so what's shocking for me is actually how little ability the president has demonstrated. Ben Wittes, I think, summed it up best, which is this is malevolence outrun by incompetence. And I think the president seems, as Eliot pointed out, to have remarkably little capacity to figure out how to accomplish what he wants to accomplish, and remarkably little appreciation for how he is activating the antibodies that are going to prevent his ability to do what he wants to do. And to the extent that I am a case in point, as a lifelong conservative, the president made an ACLU member out of me, right? When the travel ban came out, that as a measure of activating antibodies against what you are trying to achieve seems to me not irrelevant. So where I think, on national security policy, for example, it's true that the president has very wide swath of authority as the commander-in-chief. And the Congress has, in my judgment, improperly ceded the chief executive much more ground than the Congress ought to. They ought to be passing authorizations for the use of military force. They ought to be giving more scrutiny to many of the subjects that Larry brought up. But they don't lack the ability to do that. They don't lack the authority to challenge the president. To the extent that they are not challenging the president, it is, sorry, I think I did that. To the extent that they are not challenging the president, it is a function of the fact that the public is not as concerned, because otherwise Congress would be raring to go of both parties. So I'm actually pretty complacent right now that the system's working. This president has sought to intimidate journalists, has sought to affect the ability of major American newspapers to do their work, to no avail, no, to reverse avail, right? Subscriptions to the New York Times are way up. I don't know a journalist who covers the White House who isn't, who isn't desperate to be the next Woodward and Bernstein, right? Nobody's intimidated by the president. No journalist I know is intimidated by the president's efforts to intimidate them. And the quality of journalism that is going into untangling the president and his family and his appointees, grifter mentality and shady business dealings is actually fantastic. And the press has served the function that the free press was designed to serve in this country, which is shining a bright light and forcing public accountability on the president. The Republican Congress, I think, has not distinguished itself in upholding Congress. But again, the Speaker of the House is not running for re-election. 9 Republican committee chairs are not running for re-election. That suggests to me the likelihood that we are going to see a big Democratic wave in the election in the fall. That is, you are going to have political consequences for political acts, which is the right solution to this problem. And even in the Mueller investigations, it seems to me that that we need a political solution, not simply a legal solution to the president's behavior. And it looks to me like Congress is gunning up for that. If you get a Democratic Congress, which I suspect you will get at least a Democratic House in the fall, the real challenge for Democrats will be, do they choose to adjudicate the president's behavior, or do they choose a governance agenda that makes the president irrelevant? So to go back to Eliot, do they choose to do what the president's cabinet has done, which is say, ignore this guy, we know what we're doing? Or do they choose to try and impose political prices on the president at the risk of not advancing a governing agenda? It will be a Democratic choice, obviously. So a lot of the people in this room will be thinking hard about ways to affect that choice. My own sense is that a governance agenda better serves not just the country, but also Democratic Party political interests, because my sense of public attitude is that people are thirsting for boring governance again, that's going to be the biggest Trump effect, that a good, solid Midwestern governor who solved a healthcare budget crisis, who has run a balanced budget, right? I think that's going to come dramatically back into fashion by 2020, precisely because it's a response to the president.
Okay, hi. Thanks to the organizers. I want to use my 10 minutes to offer 3 observations about what I think we are addressing at this conference, and that is the relationship, in our case, between national security and the decline of democracy. The observations are based in part on some cross-national studies in comparative and international politics, but they're also based on the experiences of democratic decline in 4 cases I've studied for, I can't believe it, 4 decades and more: Russia, Hungary, Poland, and Serbia. I can also add Slovakia and the Czech Republic while I'm at it. So observation 1, threats to national security, whether real or fabricated, have played a key role in the election of leaders that have authoritarian aspirations. One good example is the election of Vladimir Putin in the Russian presidency, his first election, that is, in March 2000. Russians only began to rally around the relatively unknown Putin once he promised, and I might add in very crude fashion, the man really has a way with speaking, to win the war in Chechnya and to hunt down the terrorists that were responsible for a bombing in Moscow. Let me just say, in parentheses, we still don't know who was, what the cause of that bombing actually was. It's possible that Putin was involved in it, or people around him. At any rate, Putin's foundational claim to rule, and a claim to which he keeps returning in order to refresh his political support, very much like, I would add, Trump, Milosevic in Serbia, and Orban in Hungary, is that he, and only he, is able to keep Russians safe. His argument from the beginning was not that he was going to make them rich. It was that he was going to make them safe. The rich argument came later, in fact. More generally, as we know from Alex Mitofsky's work, over the past 30 years, there's a strong relationship between security crises, both national and personal in form, that is to say, external threats to the state, domestic and international terrorism, high crime rates, and concerns about public disorder. So between personal and national threats on the one hand, and on the other, the decline or breakdown in democracy. Observation 2. Much has been made of the cross-national rise of populist politics and politicians in Europe, hear that, Des? The United States, and elsewhere. Some of us are involved in a cross-national project on that question. But what I want to talk about is that what strikes me just as much, maybe even more, given the cases, again, I know best, is the return of extreme right-wing nationalism as a political force. This is what I see as the common thread connecting Trump, Putin, Orban, Milosevic, and the peace, law, and justice, that is, leadership in Poland. One sees that, for example, in their electoral appeals, basically protect the real people from various cultural, economic, and demographic threats. The enemies they all identify, all those others, never of the nation, who threaten the nation. Their strong ties to cultural conservatives in all of these cases. And finally, their support in small towns and rural areas. For example, Milosevic never won Belgrade, never. And Putin is losing Moscow, lost Moscow in the most recent elections. St. Petersburg is close to that, et cetera. They lose in the urban areas. They never had deep support in the urban areas. So, right-wing nationalism of the sort that you see in these cases has dangerous consequences for foreign policy, and because of that and its consequences for domestic politics, for democracy. First, far more than populism, nationalism is directly linked to national security, a term that means, after all, the security of the nation in the face of domestic as well as international threats. Second, the seductive power, but also the danger of nationalism, is that it is simultaneously an inclusionary project. I'm thinking here of Ben Anderson's concept of an imagined community, a bunch of strangers who think they have stuff in common, which is the basic argument of the book, and an exclusionary project, because defining members of the nation means differentiating them from everyone else, and in the case of right-wing nationalism, highlighting their superiority, not to mention their exceptionalism. Finally, right-wing nationalist leaders embrace two types of security policies, and both of them threaten the quality and the survival of democracy. The first is the familiar one from the 1930s, the Weimar scenario. That is, mounting an aggressive foreign policy that claims to protect the nation from internal and external threats. This is also the model that Milosevic carried out in the former Yugoslavia, and that Putin has used to many benefits for himself in terms of popular support in Ukraine. What we're seeing in Poland, Hungary, and the US, however, is a second model. And that is protecting the nation and its culture, not so much by projecting military power outward as by going it alone in foreign policy, launching trade wars, downplaying the value of alliances, cozying up to dictators, disputing the benefits of membership in multilateral organizations, and protecting borders by defending the nation and its culture, as well as the national economy, from immigrants, minorities, and bad trade. Nationalism always fuses domestic and international threats. This is one of its most powerful aspects. And it attempts to harden the boundaries between the international and domestic arenas, objectives that are, I think, familiar and understandable in a time of globalization. Moreover, I think it's important to recognize that these two models I've laid out, you don't have to choose between them. Let us remember that the wars in Yugoslavia originated in Milosevic's trade wars against the republics. Observation 3, this is my final one. When their popular support declines, political leaders tend to use international crises to divert attention away from their domestic failings and boost their poll numbers. They take this approach, no doubt, because they have fewer constraints in foreign and domestic policy, even more, as I think Larry has laid out, and because it's really easier to manipulate foreign policy public opinion than domestic public opinion, because in foreign policy you have a weird combination of high salience and low information. And so it's very easy for leaders to provide guidance for how people should feel, and that's why we see these wild shifts in foreign policy public opinion. The use of international crises to prime the leader's support, which of course a lot of leaders do. I'm thinking, 1965, Lyndon Johnson, Dominican Republic, there are many examples we could take. The end of the honeymoon, then they start messing around in the international system in order to prime support. It becomes a problem for democracy, I think, when you have some of the following characteristics. One, you have a leader who is already fond of diversionary tactics. I wonder who I might be talking about there. The second is inventing the crisis rather than it being a crisis, inventing it and making a habit of such behavior. This is precisely what we saw in the case of Serbia in the 1990s, and more recently, Russia and Hungary. Third thing that makes it bad, possibly for democracy, is using crises as a pretext for concentrating political power and for reducing civil liberties and political rights. And I might add here, let us remember that one of the big engines of this process, of course, for most of the post-war world, U.S., was the Cold War. The Cold War was often used for those purposes, and variations in that. And Stid has written on more recent cases from 9/11 on. Fourth, and this is really, I think, really important, and it's easy to miss. You know, when Milosevic, it wasn't that Milosevic mobilized popular support in Serbia. It's that he demobilized the opposition. That was what was important in what happened in Serbia. He divided and demobilized the opposition. And how did he do that? To argue against what he was doing was to argue against the Serbian nation. It was to be unpatriotic. And so the opposition was in a horrible situation. If they started arguing against him, then they were branded. But this is what nationalist leaders do, and it's very important. Finally, you use crises to destabilize neighboring countries. This is clearly what Putin has done, and it's clearly what Milosevic did as well. And that is an important thing to keep in mind. I think it's also fair to say that Hungary is engaging in a certain amount of that kind of behavior. Orban was going to be voted out of power, and the refugees showed up. And then he realized he had a great issue, and then he realized that he could really talk to nationalism. Orban has never been a nationalist until it served him. Very similar to Milosevic, a truly opportunistic, rational political actor, went where the votes were. Okay, let me end by saying the question then becomes in this discussion of the dangers of diversionary war under certain kinds of situations. Will the U.S. be the next case? To borrow from Eliot Cohen, will we run out of luck with Trump? Thank you.
Before we open it up for questions and comments from the audience, any panelists want to pick up on themes that their colleagues shared? Eliot?
For all great presentations, and I pretty much agreed with everything. Just 4 quick points. First, nobody can be as optimistic as Kori Schake is, so I won't try. But I share a lot of her optimism, in part just because, I mean, my view is that there's a kind of energy out there which is very hard to measure, which has been activated by Trump. Point 1. Point 2, I think it's important not to think of the development of the American national security state as something that's unidirectional. Let me just give you 2 examples. I don't think the FBI today would do what the FBI did in the 1930s. More importantly, think about this. Pearl Harbor and 9/11 killed roughly the same number of American citizens. After Pearl Harbor, we took tens of thousands of American citizens and we threw them into internment camps. And that was done by the liberals, or if you will, progressives. After 9/11, not only did George W. Bush not do that, George W. Bush didn't want to do that. And the first Eid al-Fitr celebration in the White House was conducted by George W. Bush, and it was generally seen to be a good thing. So I think, the country evolves, and, I think it would be a mistake to draw too many analogies with the Turkeys or countries of that type. And in that respect, maybe I'm an American exceptionalist. I plead guilty. Third, yesterday somebody made the point that Barack Obama left a loaded gun on the Resolute desk. I think that was your point. I think, and here I'm very conscious of speaking at the New America Foundation, although not mainly at New America Foundation audience. Really important to remember that. Bush father and son got congressional authorization for the use of military force in Iraq. Barack Obama did not get an authorization for the use of military force in Libya. He did not get it for the third Iraq war, which is what we've been engaged in, and he did not get it for the Syria intervention. And I think as we come out of this mess, part of what's going to happen is, boy, do conservatives have an accounting, but I'm in the thick of that. But I think liberals, progressives, whatever you want to call them, have to think about these issues very, very hard as well, because I agree that there has been this unhealthy accretion of presidential power. Last point, I mean, it seems to me the institutional question is critical, and I'm particularly curious for those of you who are scholars of Congress, whatever happened to the Senate? Because, I mean, it is the Senate that should be exercising a lot of the control on the conduct of foreign policy and the launching of wars, and we don't see that happening, and I wonder why that's the case, and can it ever change?
So in American politics and the study of the presidency, there's I would think of it as a descriptive phrase, the two presidencies, in which the domestic side you have much of what was described yesterday in the second panel. In the foreign policy and national security side, you have much of what I described. And presidents often go it alone. They take the initiative, and the other branches cede. What was really striking to me, listening to Kori's very compelling presentation, is how much of what she was describing had to do with domestic policy. The media's coverage of domestic policy and the White House beat has been extraordinary, and I agree with you. It's clearly a kind of second golden age. But in terms of what's happening abroad, it's been pretty pitiful. And I can tell you from reading international press, the enormous number of civilian casualties that are occurring in a number of countries, quite off the battlefields that we're engaged in, is not good for us as Americans or as human beings. And so, and I go through, I think your question about where's Congress is absolutely appropriate. This is part of the demise of our constitutional accountability. And I think thinking about that, though, leads you back to this larger institutional question about the rise of this tremendous administrative capacity in the executive branch. It points to the changes within Congress and why it is the Senate is not engaged. And part of that is the mismatch in capacity. Part of it is the political risk aversion. The presidents are taking huge gambles. These are high risk, high reward type of efforts. And when you do that, Congress is looking at that like, I don't want my fingerprints on this thing. It's not pretty, and I don't think any of us would defend it, but it's led to this very passive legislative branch. And what you describe in terms of passivity is also largely true in the area when you have divided government. People remember the hearings, but the intelligence committees have become, frankly, defenders of what they were supposed to be the watchdogs of. And that was a big breakdown from the church committee reforms. And you can kind of go through this long list. It's a very profound, consistent pattern.
So 2 points maybe. The first is that your point about right-wing nationalism and the parallels in other countries, I think is important. I also think it's important, though, not to treat every Trump voter as though that's what they are. That's not what you were doing. But the difference between challenges to democracy and policies you don't agree with is an important distinction to sustain and will matter hugely in terms of moving forward to break the president's electoral prospects. The second thing I would say is that one more dose of sunshine on why we shouldn't worry about democracy in America, which is the Chicago Council on Global Affairs does an annual poll of American public attitudes on America and the world. And in the last year, the year since the president was elected, they've seen 15-point swings, which is enormous as a shift in public attitude, largest they've recorded, in 3 areas: immigration, the value of alliances, and that trade is beneficial. And the trade questions were actually quite narrowly focused. Does trade make people like me richer, right? So very targeted questions. All 3 areas, 15-point swings in opposition to the president's views on those subjects. And so my theory of what is happening is that the president's good at asking first order questions, right? Why aren't allies taking advantage of us? And then people get educated on it and come up with different policy prescriptions than the president has. And that's the system working.
Good. Before we open up the questions, Valerie, one last point.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment about, I mean, people have now talked about the hollowing out of the State Department, which is pretty astonishing when I look at the figures or when I talk to people there. But I wanted to say the interesting thing about the hollowing out of the State Department is I have a former student who is a charge in Hungary dealing with the Orban crisis on a daily basis. There is no American diplomat there. All the diplomats that were political appointees were forced to resign. Most of them haven't been
Political
replaced.
appointees are always forced to resign.
No, they're usually allowed to stay around till the kids finish the school year, actually. They had to pack their bags the next morning. It was different. And anyway, so what's striking is that there's virtually no guidance from Washington. There's no involvement from Washington. And so what he has done, essentially, is to set up an alliance with the Canadian ambassador, almost works out of the Canadian ambassador's office, and pretty much does what he thinks needs to be done in responding to Orban's threats to civil liberties and political rights, especially, some of you may know, the attempted shutdown of Central European University, as well as the charming anti-Semitic kinds of activities that are associated with George Soros. So in a funny way, probably we're more effective on the ground in Hungary than we would be if there was this real State Department operating. I'm not saying that's one example, but it is a funny kind of way this is played out.
So good. Let's open it up for questions now for the audience. Questions out there? Yes, sir, in the back.
I'm Chip House from the Alliance for Peace Building, and this is really for Kori and Eliot, primarily. And it's taking you out of your professional comfort zones. So if you take your poll, Kori, that you mentioned, and we did a really bad poll that found very similar things, how do progressives work with folks like you who are in the never Trump world? How do we build public support for the kinds of trends that poll showed, and how do progressives work with your wing of the Republican Party to provide what one of you called better governance after the next election?
Eliot, you are so much more prominent in this as one of the major voices. Maybe you should answer that.
Well, first, just stipulate I quit the Republican Party the week after the election, so you're associating with a homeless person here.
The Bull Moose.
Yeah, if the Bull Moose Party came back, I'd join that. I think, the truth is, I have found myself engaging with all kinds of people, including Bernie Sanders, believe it or not, that I never would have engaged with before. And I think you'll find the door wide open. I also, whatever venue, there are groups like this Patriots and Pragmatists group that's out there, which I'm part of. I think the problem is at the moment it's a lot of intellectuals talking to one another. The challenge is going to be much more engaging with politicians. And until you have more Republicans who are, going to be willing to stay in politics and engage, I think it'll be difficult. But on a one-on-one basis, the door is wide open. The problem is, as far as I can see, that the Republican Party has collectively decided to bend the knee and to go along, even if they privately seethe. And I also think, as I said in one of those pieces, that the Republican foreign policy establishment is going to be divided right down the middle, because there are going to be people who want to go in, and it sounds even like today that so people who signed my evil first letter, they may let them in, but not people who signed the second, even more evil letter, which I helped write. Those are cast into the outer darkness forever. So, I think here's the thing. I think you'll find plenty of people. There are plenty of people to talk to. The question is, what do we do?
Yeah. Good. Other questions? Theta?
One quick point. one thing missing in this conference is a panel on the Republican Party. And I really do think that needed to, you could have the Democrats too, but I think understanding what has happened to the Republican Party to tune toward being an ethno-nationalist party, not based on majority American views, I quite agree that that's not the case, but intense minorities and this president's prodding. But let me just ask a quick question. What is the changing nature of the technology of war and the incidence of military service as we've moved toward a voluntary army, military, where the terrible human costs of fighting are visited upon relatively poor states and their communities, their young men and women? What does that have to do with freeing up any presidential decision makers, Donald Trump or others, to do these foreign strikes that appear to be limited because they're based on air power and drones, but could, in the current situation, lead to a broader conflagration?
So the technology, you're principally talking about precision strikes and persistent surveillance, drones and weaponized drones, or surveillance platforms that permit very careful, long-distance American engagement. And while I share the concern about civilian deaths, it's also true, though, that these technologies make it safer for the United States to engage in wars elsewhere. So what is surprising is actually that it's not more in use, not that it's less in use. And I myself think the focus on drones is misplaced because, in particular, the alternative is sending teams of American soldiers to do that work or not doing it at all. And I think in many of the cases, let's just take Yemen to be specific, the war in Yemen is terrible, blundering, and costly, and tragic. And Iran probably didn't cause it, as the Saudis and Emiratis claim. But this is now a war between the Iranian government on the one side of Yemen and Saudis and Emiratis on another side of it, with Yemeni civilians caught in between. And that is typically how wars get fought. Right? It's
the great wars in American history, the Civil War and World War II, went hand in hand with democratization in a broader sense because large numbers of soldiers were needed to fight those.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. Excuse me. So we're 50 years into an all-volunteer force in the United States, and what the genius of that system is that it aligns the people running the greatest risks with the people willing to run the greatest risks to do it. So it does give the president pays less political cost, both because of the structure of the system and because the wars we have been fighting for the last 20 years are not wars that require enormous amounts of manpower.
Larry, one quick comment, then we'll open up.
One of the arguments in the Democratic accountability or Democratic wars literature is about the importance of accountability. So this cuts straight away to Theda's comment. And the concern of people like David Cole, who's helps to run the organization that you've now joined, the ACLU, but was a law professor at Georgetown for many years, is precisely that the use of drones and other technologies has permitted unaccountable warfare. And the numbers I put up about the use of drones and other kinds of airstrikes are alarming. And in the international arena, the United States is now increasingly targeted because while there's an absolute defense when your country is under attack or you're in an active battlefield like Afghanistan, but we're launching wars or military strikes using drones in other countries in which we are not engaged, in which there is no congressional authorization, in which the UN is totally engaged. We're off on our own. This is, to me, an undemocratic problem, and it's really part of the backlash that Eliot's talking about.
Good. Sydney Terrell.
Several of the panelists have mentioned the links between domestic and foreign policy, and I wonder if there isn't a linkage that hasn't yet come up, and it has to do with racism. You may recall about a week ago, Trump went out of his way in West Virginia to repeat the charge that the Mexicans are sending rapists. Now, what does that have to do with West Virginia? And what does it have to do with taxes, which he was supposed to talk about but threw up in the air?
Infrastructure week.
Right. What it has to do with is Trump talking to his base. And talking to his base doesn't just have to do with domestic policy, it has to do with foreign policy as well. The wall and all of the rhetoric having to do with the wall is really about American foreign policy as well as domestic politics. And what I worry about is that as he gets weaker politically, and the data on public opinion polls supports this, Kori, as he gets weaker, he will become more desperate and he will reach more deeply into his core, like many movement leaders do. And that core is a core that is fundamentally driven by racism.
Can I make
Go on.
one comment on Sid's comment? It's not just racism, it's sexism. I mean, it's all about, right-wing nationalism is all about, among other things, in various cases, about both racism and sexism. It always is. It's protect our little flowers of womanhood from these monsters. And so it crosses over into that. And that's one reason why, I didn't have time to lay it out, but it's one reason why I wanted to focus on the issue of right-wing, extreme right-wing nationalism, because it has these characteristics, but it also looks both outward and inward in terms of the construction of enemies.
Good. We have time for one more question. Rick, you've been waiting here, please.
This is a question for Kori and for Eliot. Eliot, you've focused on, in your writings that we read for the conference, on how lucky we've been so far. And obviously one of the things that you worry about is our luck running out, and how, when our luck runs out, that will in fact feed into American politics, as well as have possibly, no one has come back to the point that you made, which is that the prospect of civilization-ending war is now front and center in a way that it hasn't been in a long time. Certainly, we're not in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we could get into a crisis in which, we rush to read Alice and try to figure out what's going to happen in the next few hours. And by then it might be too late. So, not to get dramatic, but I'm just wondering what you think about the likely scenarios. We seem to be on hold in terms of the Korean Peninsula crisis, and so, but obviously things are happening that we just simply have no way of, as ordinary citizens, of understanding. And so, how do you parse the likely scenarios? And so, this is directed to both of you, who I think about this every day.
Well, I think there are a whole bunch of scenarios, including the Korean Peninsula. I mean, as you say, it's on hold for now. But one of the things that really struck me, I took a group of about 40 students to Korea less than a month ago. And my associate director and I, who'd been in the Obama Defense Department, spent a lot of time talking to military and intelligence friends saying, we're there to study the first Korean War. We'd rather not be in the middle of the second one. And, the uniform answer that we got from people who'd be fighting the war is, well, March is okay. And a longer term, they would all say 50-50. And I think that is still entirely there because of, North Koreans have always cheated. But by the way, just one point on North Korea, as on all these things, the issues out there are real. Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they're real. This is, Obama using drones, Trump using drones, this is not recreational. There is a reason why they're doing this. It is a response to an external threat. The point that I'll just make and then hand it off to Kori is this, and in a way it goes to what some of the stuff we've been hearing about Trump voters. And I would add to that Scotch Ball saying you should do something on the Republican Party. Should be something on the Trump voters, because I don't think they're simply kind of crazed, sexist nationalists. I think there are a lot of them who are reacting to all kinds of different things that have been going on in their lives and in their communities and things that they've heard from people in power. I think if there is a bloody war, a lot of those people will peel away from Trump.
So Eliot's last point is the one that makes.
So
that-
clearly some third base coaching there, but let's come back to the, we'll give Kori the last word.
Eliot's last point is the one that makes me more sanguine that the president's not going to do something reckless and exorbitantly costly to the United States and others. So a war on the Korean Peninsula, us choosing to preventatively destroy the North Korean nuclear programs in the best possible circumstance of military virtuosity, you end up with about 200,000 dead South Koreans. A president voluntarily taking that action would collapse the geopolitical order, right? It would collapse America's alliance relations everywhere. I think President Trump is easily reckless enough to do that. What I do not think he is willing to actually pull the trigger on it. So I think the president's basically a chicken hawk. What he'd like is the first Syria strike, right? He gets to talk tough. You have something limited. So I think there was a lot of attraction to a sort of bloody nose theory for North Korea, which is utter nonsense that that's how this would play out. And again, the idea got fumigated, and all of us national security experts started explaining why that's nonsense. Even on Fox News, people started saying it was nonsense, and that, I think, got through to the president. So what I worry about are quick decisions that the president makes, but in most national security cases, he floats trial balloons, and then that allows the Secretary of Defense and the public conversation to come back and get the president.
Can I just say, I agree with that, but I think with any president, there's a chance of stupid things happening. And with this president, there is a much higher chance of a stupid sequence of events. And I just remind everybody, this is the centennial of the First World War. And if Franz Ferdinand's driver had just said, "Boss," after that assassination attempt, why don't we just go back to the hotel and call it a day? It might not have happened.
Okay, last comment here, Larry.
And I would just end on this note. This is all in the decision of the administration.
So, very good note. We've oscillated here between civilization. I think we need to wrap up. Why don't you connect with the panelists during the break? We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll regroup here for the next panel. Thank you.